Hi everyone, I'm here today to talk about another geopolitical book that I read very early in the year. Anne Applebaum is an American historian, but one who spent a lot of time living in the United States, England, and Poland, and she researches specifically Eastern Europe and Russia in the era of the Soviet Union. She's also a journalist who currently contributes to The Atlantic. I've read and reviewed two of her historical works on this channel, Red Famine and Iron Curtain, but I haven't gotten to her most famous one, Gulag, yet. Anyway, the book that I read most recently is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. It's also her most recent book, and unlike the others I mentioned, it's less of a focused historical account, and instead more of an exploratory essay on the state of democracy worldwide. About 5 hours in its audiobook format, it explores modern trends towards an authoritarian, anti-democratic nationalism around the world, or really mostly in the West within the scope of this book. It compares these movements with historical movements, and then ventures into some speculation about the psychology that drives people to support these movements. The book was published in 2020, and I learned about it through Applebaum's interview a year or two ago on the Ezra Klein show, which was good conversation, and which was my first introduction to the author at all, actually. I'll link that interview in the description in case you're interested in listening yourself, although I wouldn't really mark that one as a must here. The book is thought-provoking, but it's quite a bit less substantive and focused than her longer historical works. Like some other books of its kind, it reads more as a series of extended articles for a newspaper or magazine than a fully coherent body of research. She introduces some intriguing ideas, but none of them receive quite enough focus in this short work to totally convince us of their validity. That's not to say they're wrong, but rather that they're just the start of a thought process, and further reading and reflection would be essential for someone like me to really assess whether I agree or disagree with Applebaum's claims. The book isn't the easiest to follow in terms of ideas, but it does walk us through a few main claims using specific countries as case studies. Applebaum introduces as examples the Eastern European nations of Poland and Hungary, with their authoritarian-tending movements led by Jaroslaw Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party in Poland and Viktor Orban's Fidesz Party in Hungary. Next, she delves into the fracturing of the political right in the UK, specifically in England, leading up to the Brexit vote and to the rise of Boris Johnson. And then she briefly explores Spain's right-wing Vox party that has also come into vogue recently, before devoting a final chapter to her home country, the United States, and of course, Trumpism. Notably, these are all examples of right-wing movements. Applebaum, much of a centrist herself with lots of conservative ties, is upfront about this fact, but she points out that authoritarianism is not necessarily a right-wing phenomenon. After all, she spent a good part of her career researching Stalinist communism, which originated from a very different part of the political spectrum. So she also explores a bit about why, as she sees it, the current global threat to democracy is coming from the right. It's a discussion that, frankly, I think would require a lot more than a few parts of a 5-hour book to do it justice. But one reason she offers is that right-wing political parties in different countries, even some very nationalistic parties, have managed with the help of social media and internet forums to unify with one another, at least to some extent, and thus have collectively pursued some common goals and ideologies. These might include anti-globalism or opposition to the European Union, opposition to immigration, and pursuit of a more Christian-centered political and moral landscape, which often includes opposition to feminism, gay rights, and specifically these days, although not by any means exclusively, Muslim immigrants. And I should clarify, I mean Christian in name and rhetoric, though one could of course dispute whether they're actually espousing a Christian ethos or merely using the notion of Christianity as a political strategy for advancing other agendas. It's an idea harking back to the Crusades, for example, although that certainly was hardly the only such instance from history. And Applebaum argues that evoking imagery of days gone by, like the Crusades, is exactly what astute Spanish politicians are trying to do right now. And why exactly is this? Well, one of the chapters in the book, the one more focused on Brexit in the UK, explores the role of what writer Svetlana Boym, one of Applebaum's key sources, referred to in her book The Future of Nostalgia as restorative nostalgia. Applebaum provides copious evidence that Brexiteers, along with many other current conservatives throughout the West, directly appeal to voters' nostalgia for a bygone era. And I think without judging whether we should be doing such a thing, it's not particularly controversial to say that this is what conservative parties are doing. For example, Trump ran on the slogan, "Make America Great Again," which clearly is an embodiment of this sort of restorative nostalgia. There was an America that's great, and we need to get it back again. But using the example of Britain, Applebaum focuses specifically on the UK's desire to see itself as once again a global leader and superpower, much as it viewed itself, perhaps with some validity, immediately after its victory in World War II. Though Applebaum doesn't specifically make a connection here, it's interesting to ponder how similar sentiments might apply in the US, which certainly remains a global superpower, but maybe not quite as relatively dominant as before, given the growing relative power of China. But I'm digressing here. However, unlike the nostalgia of when we reflect fondly upon the past, but see it as a time that is gone forever, replaced by inevitable changes in society, restorative nostalgia sees this past as something that has been lost, but only temporarily, and can be reattained through the right policies. This romanticized image of the past may or may not be rooted in actual historical reality, but it exerts a strong pull, and to truly revert to a previous time is, of course, impossible. Applebaum points out that no serious Brexiteers are actually arguing, for example, that Britain needs to reclaim all of its former colonies in the exact same way it controlled them historically. But the political emotions such nostalgia evokes are, in Applebaum's view, a key impulse that drives people to support current right-wing movements even when they have authoritarian tendencies. And I should point out as well, Applebaum makes it clear that right-wing does not necessarily imply authoritarianism, nationalism, or anti-globalization. She cites Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as two examples of well-beloved conservatives who actually espoused some form of liberalism or neoliberalism and were really open to globalization. So it's really the current breed of right-wing movements that have attracted Applebaum's and others' attention. Next, in a part of the book that I find a bit more controversial and not quite as logically easy to follow, Applebaum tries to distinguish between those on the right who have moved in the past, let's say, quarter century, more along a moderate trajectory, you might say center-right trajectory, to where she might identify herself, versus those who have particularly recently embraced these authoritarian-leaning movements, and that even includes people who she previously thought of as quite reasonable. She actually focuses on two separate groups of people who she argues are to blame for the rise of authoritarianism, although the lines are not always totally clear. On one hand, there are everyday people who may have authoritarian personalities, and on the other hand, there are the former intellectuals, or clercs. Borrowing a term from Julien Benda's book, La Trahison des Clercs, or roughly translated, the betrayal or treason of the intellectuals. Focusing on that first group for now, though, Applebaum characterizes many supporters of modern right-wing authoritarianism as basically having a personality that's threatened by pluralism, by heterogeneity of ideas, and by overall complexity on a level that we as humans are simply not accustomed to dealing with. She claims that this is a variable dimension of personality that can influence how we feel about ethnic diversity in our communities, can foster fundamentally different ideas about morality, or even can just determine whether our good idea of a weekend is going out deer hunting or visiting the newest installation at the local art museum. Now, I'll buy that such a mindset that includes an acute awareness of potential threats and a preference for stability over change, that this mindset exists, that it's prevalent in the world today, and that it's exacerbated by many features of modern society. And I'll also buy that it's a common factor that propels support for simplistic narratives that attempt to make sense of our complex societies. But to call it an ingrained personality type is something that isn't sufficiently justified or really even explained in this book, which is kind of a problem given the number of times that Applebaum appeals to it. I think there's probably quite a bit more nuance to it than that, and I also think that there must be ways to increase or decrease our authoritarian tendencies throughout life, even if some people have some natural tendency to be more interested in conformity and simple unifying narratives than others do. I'd also have to push back against the notion that such a quality is uniquely prevalent right now in supporters of right-wing nationalist parties, because as we see, for example, in cancel culture of some ultra-progressive communities on the left, encouraging or even allowing a variety of dissenting opinions on the issues of the day isn't something that we as humans are particularly good at on either side of the political spectrum. We simply like simple explanations, and that makes sense because they make us feel safer than complicated ones that we can't understand. Though, admittedly, Applebaum would probably agree with me on this. I think she's actually written on the very topic herself in the past year for The Atlantic. She probably would reaffirm that instead, neither side is immune to the appeal of simple explanations and solutions, but for some of the reasons she's talked about in this book, the right-wing movements have become a lot more unified and found more common ground than many of the current left-wing movements. So left-wing authoritarian movements are less of an immediate global political threat. Similarly, Applebaum is quite critical of these anti-democratic political parties, as I think she should be, for the means they employ, but I don't think she's quite generous enough to the voters who support such parties. Yeah, I'm no fan of these parties either, and I think it's a mistake to support them. But in spite of Applebaum's apparent effort to empathize with and understand the experiences of such voters, in the end they all do kind of just come across in her portrayal as gullible, selfishly motivated, and maybe even just bullies by their very nature if you buy her whole authoritarian personality argument. And this unfortunately feels in the end just like another spin on the stereotypical way that people on the left view people on the right. I would have preferred to see a final discussion that at least lends some legitimacy to the sentiments and the experiences of voters supporting these parties with authoritarian tendencies without going as far as to condone those parties and leaders themselves. Maybe that's a lot to ask for such a short book, but it's one reason that this book just didn't totally amaze me. Of course, Applebaum does address a group of people termed clerics for the reasons I mentioned a minute ago, and those are basically the intellectuals whom she thinks should know better, but who have become opportunists in this new political environment, exploiting the masses' ingrained desire for simplicity and order to advance their own careers, without much regard at all for the broader impacts of the ideas they espouse. She argues that these intellectuals, while still purportedly claiming to be interested in knowledge, understanding, or truth, since this is the definition in this context of intellectuals, have basically reoriented themselves so that they're simply using this perception and this assumption of good faith to lend support to these authoritarian leading parties or factions on the right because these movements have power, rewards, and influence to offer them, and because being an intellectual gets you nothing except for hopefully a deeper understanding of the world, especially if your conclusions are unpopular. Thus, instead of using their intellects to explain the world as they observe it in an unbiased way, they're using their intellects here to explain the world in ways that are politically advantageous. This is an intriguing argument, but it doesn't quite come together in this book. That is, I think a treason of the intellectuals is possible, but Applebaum still hasn't fully convinced me that this is what's happening on a widespread level, despite presenting some evidence to support her claim. It's also made even harder to parse by Applebaum's inclusion of herself within the narrative. You see, some of the clerics Applebaum criticizes are former acquaintances whom she no longer speaks with, and the overall tone of this book makes it hard at times to tell to what extent Applebaum is taking an objective stance against actual political trends and shifts, versus taking digs at people who have diverged from her politically, and usually here it is, I think, some combination of both. Nevertheless, it's a thought-provoking claim at the very least, and people interested in exploring further might be encouraged to read Benda's La Trahison des Clercs for a further exploration of the theory. That looks to be a relatively short book, and you can find it in English too. So although I don't think Applebaum is necessarily wrong in many cases, she doesn't have enough time here to fully develop all these ideas within the scope of this book, and thus the narrative she presents feels perhaps a bit too final and oversimplified. Still, if you're interested in this kind of political discourse, it's a book that will make you think, and that's true whether you identify with Applebaum's own political alignment or not. So it's worth a read if you have time, but not the first thing I'd suggest. In fact, some parts of the book actually reminded me of other things I've read in the past few years that address some of these topics in a way that doesn't strictly overlap with Twilight of Democracy, but that goes into greater depth in certain areas and might make for a more satisfying and focused reading experience overall. So for a deeper dive into authoritarianism over the last half-century or so, including some more recent movements that have arisen from the left, I'd recommend checking out former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's book, Fascism Warning. Yeah, you should of course take what she says with a grain of salt, as with anything you read, especially what she has to say about the Clinton administration's decisions, and since she was a key player there. But overall, I thought it was an informative look into some of these modern geopolitical trends towards authoritarianism that Applebaum discusses. Then up a totally different alley, if you're interested in the brief parts of Applebaum's work that discuss the role of social media as a political tool or even a weapon of sorts, which I didn't discuss here at all, I highly recommend Peter Singer's book, Like War, which explores this topic in great depth. That one maybe gets a little bit repetitive by the end, and given the fast movement in this space, it's probably already a bit out of date just 3 years after its publication. But all in all, I think most of it probably still rings true. And certainly it's describing trends in the political use of social media that remain very relevant. So thanks for watching, and I hope you found something of value in this review. Bye, and happy reading.